I'm David Johnson from Transform Ed Consulting, and we have as our guest tonight, Dr. Neil Kingston. Hi, Neil. How you doing?
I am doing wonderful. Good to see you, David.
I gotta tell y'all, Neil and I are brothers. We're both from New York. He's the best of the best. All right. Neil Kingston, PhD, is University Distinguished Professor in Research, Evaluation, Measurement, and Statistics in the Educational Psychology Department. And he is Director of the Achievement and Assessment Institute, both at the University of Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas. His research focuses on how assessment can better support student learning. Dr. Kingston began his career as a high school teacher where his interest in personalized learning led him to develop an individualized approach to teaching ninth grade science. Encouraged by this work, he completed a master's degree in psychology and education and then a doctorate in measurement and research design at Teachers College, Columbia University in New York City. Before arriving at KU, Dr. Kingston worked at several testing companies, including Educational Testing Service, Measured Progress, and CTB McGraw-Hill. He also served as Associate Commissioner for Curriculum and Assessment in the Kentucky Department of Education. Dr. Kingston has numerous endorsements of his research, evaluation, and measurement skills, as well as endorsements on psychometrics. Welcome, Neil. You certainly have an impressive background, and I have lots of questions for you. Tell our audience, if you would, what psychometrics is and what it entails.
So psychometrics is a combination of statistical modeling applied to human reasoning or toward measurement in general. So we're always assessing things, everything we do. We look at another person, we assess them. Well, add on to that some mathematical models and statistics and large numbers of people and equations. That's psychometrics.
Mm-hmm. And you studied psychology. What is the connection between psychology and psychometrics?
So psychometrics is psychological measurement, psychometrics. And there are lots of different aspects to psychology, including what you learn, achievement, what makes you go, motivation, personality traits, etc. So the domain is the domain of psychology, broadly writ. I'm in the field of educational psychology, so I focus primarily on those aspects that are related to education. But that measurement of it, that's where the metrics part comes in.
I'm glad you mentioned the psychology of education. I think people don't quite take that into consideration of the difference between, let's say, I was a psych major and someone who says, I studied the psychology of education. Help us understand the difference between being a psych major and studying the psychology of education.
Well, there's a lot of overlap, but it's just a question really of specificity. So one of the areas that has long been a part of psychology was sort of one of the mainstreams of psychology back in the 1920s and 30s was learning. Learning is an aspect of psychology. How do people learn well? What are the ways that people can help themselves learn better? And so all of that has been rigorously studied. I'm not saying we have answers to all of those questions, but we've spent a lot of time studying it, and lots of people are still studying it. What psychometrics and what research, evaluation, measurement, and statistics within a school of education does is provides those methodological tools for those people who are interested in those substantive areas to do better research.
Now, Neil, tonight's topic is competency-based education. I would believe that when people hear competency-based, they're thinking of the physical aspect of doing, learning. What is the connection between the physical learning and the psychological learning, which occurs within the mind, which occurs within the brain?
So before you can do something, you have to think about what it is that you're doing. So that physical behavioral aspect of it, which is the manifestation that we see, and it's critical, that's what people can know and understand, is preceded by how do you get there? And so that's where competency-based education and psychology and educational psychology overlap with each other. And it
Hmm.
all starts, there's another important aspect of all of this, which is often referred to as backward design. It's hard to get to where you want to go if you don't know where that is. So backward design in competency-based education, or in education in general, says let's start by identifying what do we want people to be able to do. And it's amazing when you do that, people understand each other. Whereas if you say, oh, I'm a biology major, oh, I'm a biology major too. Do we know the same things? Well, I study plants. No, I study animals. Well, maybe we don't overlap quite that much. Knowing the competencies, it's not just study plants or animals. What can you do with plants or animals? And so starting with, you've got to identify those things that you want people to be able to do at the end of an educational program. That's what we agree on about competency education, what the field agrees upon. After that, we've got a whole bunch of academics arguing with each other about what are the most important aspects of it. And we're a research university at Kansas, so we're trying to help figure out what are the things that matter most. At the same time, we're trying to build programs or think about building programs in the future. And
Now, Neil, you sort of touched this. Uh, as I bragged earlier, we're both from New York. Kansas is a long way from New York. How did you decide to become an academic?
so I had worked most of my career for testing companies. And I was getting increasingly frustrated as my thinking matured within the field. I've often used the example that the testing enterprise sometimes is like using a cannon to swat a fly. We have all this mechanism, we spend all this money, we put in all this effort. Why are we doing this? Well, I would argue, and I came to realize and feel every year more strongly about this, if our assessment work isn't helping students learn better and teachers teach better, we are wasting our time and effort. And since at the time that I came to Kansas 16 years ago, most of the testing enterprise wasn't doing what I thought was important, I said, okay, enough of that, time for me to go somewhere else. And I was talking to a colleague on the phone one day, and he said, you know, we have a job. We have an open rank faculty position at the University of Kansas. I said, nah, I don't publish enough. I'm a doer. I'm out there trying to put programs in place that help students, and universities want people who've published lots of articles. You don't lose anything if you don't try, Neil. Okay, I put in my application, and here I am 16 years later, rose up the ranks quickly from associate professor without tenure to distinguished professor with tenure, and heading the largest research institute at the university.
Well, sir, you have a very, very impressive background. Well, our topic today is competency-based education, a tool to increase college access and equity. We have four bullet points that we will discuss tonight. What is competency-based education? How does competency-based education improve access and equity? What about the quality of learning? Why aren't more colleges using CBE? Where would you like to start, Neil?
Let's start at the beginning, what it is.
Okay,
I told you
start right at
part
the
of it.
beginning.
I told you about, we all agree that you need to have these competencies, these things that people are going to do. I also said we need backward design. So you start with the competencies, and then, very different than traditional ways of building courses, you go to assessment, because part of a competency, how do you know if someone's mastered it? And so you have to write the right kinds of assessments that allow students to show what it is they can do with the material.
Mhm,
And now finally, you're ready to do the instructional design.
mhm,
And the other, I would argue, most powerful version of competency-based education that addresses some of the problems we have in higher education. When you become a professor, normally, you're expected to know and do everything that you never studied yourself. You didn't study how to become a teacher. You didn't study how to write a test. No, you studied, going back to biology, you studied biology. You know a lot about biology, and you figure it out or you don't with those specialized areas. And so I like competency-based education that brings together teams of people that together work to do the best possible job putting together materials to help folks learn.
Now,
So,
Neil,
yeah.
you know that I was in the Air Force, and in the Air Force for young enlisted troops,
Mm-hmm.
we have, and I'm going to forget exactly. You have OJT, which is on the job training,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have, I don't know whether it's called academic, but you have CDCs. Now I don't remember what CDCs mean. Anyway, you had an academic portion and you had a hands-on portion.
Right.
In competency-based education, what is the balance?
You you need both. And if you start by developing the right competencies, you can make sure that you've covered both. So before you're ready to do something, you've got to learn some things. But until you can do something with it, the things you learned before, people talk about Bloom's taxonomy, and you start with sort of knowledge and understanding, then comprehension, and then you can apply it, and then you can analyze situations, etc. You can't get to those higher levels if you don't learn the first levels, but if you stop at the first levels, it wasn't worth anything. You can't do anything with it. So in the design of the programs, you need to think about that balance, which may be different for different programs because the goals of different programs can be different.
Mm-hmm.
And so you build the competencies, you do the backward design, you create the programs, but you're still not there to get the power, to get the equity and access issues to a place where you can address them. So another part of all of this is you need to move away from the traditional model of both higher education and frankly K-12 education also, which I'll refer to as seat time. You need to sit
Seat
in a
time.
seat
Oh, you
time.
mean I got my 3 hours in?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
sat in that seat 3 hours this week. I did it for 15 weeks. I'm
Right.
ready to go.
Right. Yeah. In fact,
Well,
what is it? They must have 240 hours or something like that in seat time.
so
Yeah.
it varies depending where and what, but that's the way that it is looked at.
Right.
And it's ridiculous in so many different ways. Some people can learn one area faster, another area may be slower. Others are the reverse of that.
Mm-hmm.
Some just need more time to put all the pieces together. Some are ready to leap forward. Some had life experiences. They
Mm-hmm.
started college maybe after the military.
Mm-hmm.
And in the military, they got lots of expertise, lots of training,
Mm-hmm.
or through their hobbies, they did that. And typically, none of that counts.
But what about testing out of various courses? I
So
forget the name of the program, but
there,
there are a lot of testing out programs.
there are, but they only cover parts of what you conceivably know.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the advanced placement program. You
Mm-hmm.
may have taken courses in high school. There are other programs also. They usually only address the entry level courses
Mm-hmm.
and they'll get you so far, but not farther. Sometimes at some universities, they count only to exempt you from taking a course, but you still need the
The
same number
credit
of
hours.
credits,
Right.
120 or
Right.
128 or whatever.
Right.
Why? There is no good reason, I would argue.
All right, Neil, I'm going to push you because
Go
you're
ahead.
going there, and I'll just push you the rest of the way there. Equity and access. So when you ask the question, why does the student still need those credit hours when he or she has demonstrated knowledge or mastery of something in a test out system? So what does that do for equity and access?
Well, if you put these things together, and I want to put one or two other things on the table, and then I'll go to that question.
Okay.
So another part of it, right now, we start courses at the beginning of a semester,
Mm-hmm.
and you end them at the end of the semester. And so not only does seat time bind you, well, so does semester structure bind you. Now let's move. I've got enough things on the table. Let's move forward with this idea. There are people who, for whatever set of reasons, advances, privileges that they have,
Mm-hmm.
money that's provided to them, maybe it was their families, maybe it's scholarship,
Mm-hmm.
but they can focus on 4 years of college. They don't have to work a job. They don't have to support their parents. They don't have a sick relative to take care of. For whatever the set of reasons are, traditional higher education works well for many people. I'd argue still competency-based education will work better, but there are all these other people that face all these other issues I was talking about. And these issues are certainly very connected to socioeconomic kinds of issues. If you're if you don't even know what to do, if you never were thinking about going to college because your family doesn't have money, so you thought it was out of reach, even if there's scholarship programs, you still don't know what to do and how to do it. You still might feel an obligation to work a job. You still may not be able to regularly go to that class because you don't know which day your mother or your father or your sibling is going to have a problem that requires you to take them to the doctor, or there are large segments of our population that just have different circumstances. How do we make higher education more flexible?
Now, Neil, I'm going to get you. I'm going to jump you here. We would call those non-traditional students.
Mm-hmm.
So whose responsibility is it that those students succeed? Is it the school that should adapt to the students, or should the students adapt to the traditional school setup?
So it's ridiculous to think that all students can adapt to a situation that was built for a very small subset of students originally. As somewhat of a history of both education and especially of measurement, people had to be extremely privileged to have any high probability of going to college before World War II. World War II changed the game in many ways, got us on the path we are now.
GI Bill.
The GI Bill, which I'll share with you. Many people don't know why the GI Bill was put in place. The GI Bill was put in place not necessarily for the best of motivations. It turned out quite well for us. It was put in place because during World War II, women took over lots of jobs in the workplace. And now the men were coming back from war because it was still a world where that's how things went. And disrupting the economy was a great concern. How do we slow down the reintegration of the soldiers coming back to the United States? Let's send more of them off to college. And so the GI Bill did wonderful things. It really changed the landscape of higher education and changed the economy and built a middle class stronger than ever had existed before in that generation that came back from World War II and into the 50s and into the 60s. It was phenomenal what it did. But it still didn't go, I would argue, far enough. It's always a societal problem issue to make sure that there's opportunity for folks, regardless of where they're starting. So no, I don't put there is responsibility that individuals have, but fitting yourself, shoehorning yourself into a system that was made for a different time and place is not one of those responsibilities of the individual.
Okay, Neil, I'm going to go back. Of course, we were conversing before we went live. And you and I were probably the same kind of students in high school and our first years in college. How much of your beliefs and approaches and theories now are based in your experience as an undergrad?
A lot of them. So I shared with you before, and it's not that I'm proud of it. I use myself often as a tale of hope for parents. I was a terrible student. I was on a course that things could have gone really, really bad. And I've wound up being quite successful by a number of ways of looking at things. So parents, including some of my relatives themselves who are worried about their kids, one has to develop and learn. It's possible. There is hope for all of them. But
so tell me how that's reflected in your thinking now.
Sure. As I was going through all of this experience, I did often think, I was very introspective, well, what might have worked better for me? And I had lots of bad ideas about what that would have been. But as I continued over the decades to think about what it takes to help more people be more successful, and as I, almost by accident, wound up in the field of testing and measurement, I shared with you before, if you want, I'll share with the audience also. I didn't go into testing and measurement because I knew a darn thing about that field even existing. I went into that because I asked the maybe wrong question when I was trying to prove myself. I thought I wanted to go in counseling psychology and help students who were confused as I was to be better students. And I asked the other students who were already in the doctoral program, the one that I aspired to get into, but was not qualified to get into at this point in time, what were the hardest courses you had to take? And they all said statistics and educational measurement and psychological measurement. And so I took those courses and did well, and only realized afterwards, well, the one reason they found that hard, those courses hard, they were people persons. And numbers didn't come natural to many of them, the ones I talked to at least. They did come natural to me. And then I discovered this field. So I go into the field. And I learned that a lot of the practices we had weren't really helping students learn better, weren't helping teachers teach better. Why are we spending all this time and effort if we're not going to accomplish what our main goal is as educators, helping students learn? And so I asked the question. I had an opportunity about 2010, I think it was 2009 or 10, to write a grant for a new kind of testing system for students with significant cognitive disabilities, the most challenged learners that we have in our schools, about 1% of the students who are the lowest achieving. And I started by throwing out all the assumptions that we normally have about assessment. It wasn't going to be at the end of the year. It's too late at the end of the year to do anything with those kinds of results. It wasn't going to be summative in nature. It had to give feedback to teachers in the midst of student learning so I can do something about it. It had to be what I called instructionally relevant. It had to help teachers think about what good instructional activities would look like. In fact, my idea of good assessment is assessment that you can't tell from good instruction. It needs to be put together as a seamless whole. Anyway, that's what got me to where I am. I was at the University of Kansas for a while, and a new provost came in place and was talking about competency-based education as a thing of interest to her. And I had a few epiphanies that I, in fact, had been working in the space of competency-based education on multiple occasions in the past. I had been hired by a couple of universities in Saudi Arabia and went over there to teach outcomes assessment to some of their faculty. Well, that's some of the same things that we're talking about. I had taken a physics course in 1973 that was competency-based. I didn't remember that I had done that until I started working in this area again. It wasn't about seat time. It was about going into that physics lab whenever I had the time and inclination to do so, and working toward demonstrating, learning and demonstrating another competency that was part of that program.
Well, let's talk about the quality of learning. You said you didn't realize that when you took this exam or this course that it was competency-based. What is the qualitative difference between a competency-based course and a traditional, let's say,
Sure.
academic-based course?
So before I answer that question, let me say why I think this is an important question for anyone out there who wants to think about moving in this direction in their own institutions, and that includes K-12 schools as well as higher education, which is often competency-based education is spoken about negatively as, oh, that's an approach for trade schools, or that's an approach for low-level learning. No, it isn't. What competency-based education is about is identifying what you're trying to do and then doing it. And if your goals for what you want students to be able to do are high-level goals, well, now you can aim at making sure those are met. And if they're low-level goals, well, that's what you're aiming for. So it's not the level of education. It's not the kind of program. It's the fact that without knowing where you're going, it's hard to get there. And so starting with a backward design process in competency-based education allows people to know, if I'm a student, it lays out what I'm going to learn. If I'm a teacher, it lays out what's important for the students. If I'm an employer, it makes clear what does this student know when I hire them, because frankly, and I've heard this from lots of employers, if I look at a student transcript, I have no idea what they know. If I look at a transcript from two different universities, I have no idea who's the better student.
Because you don't
Or
have a
what?
report of their competencies.
No, all you have is this thing called a course. What does that course mean?
All right, Neil, you touched on it. You mentioned high level, low level. So I'm going to assume you're talking about Bloom's taxonomy.
Hmm.
And I would agree with you that people would place competency-based education at the applied level and not at the uh,
Synthesis or
synthesis level.
evaluation would be the real high
Yes,
ones. Yeah.
synthesis and evaluation, HOTS, higher order thinking
Yep.
skills. Hmm. So what's your response to those who say competency-based is applied learning?
Only if you want it to be.
Go
If
on.
your competencies are addressing those HOTS, if they're addressing that synthesis, that evaluation, if they're addressing complex tasks that you want people to do, then you haven't lowered it, you've raised it.
You've placed a lot of emphasis on starting with the end in mind
Hmm.
and backward planning. How is that competency based?
It doesn't have to be. People can, and so I started earlier, I said, we don't have a widespread agreement on what all the terms around competency education actually mean. So
Mhm.
I'm telling you what I think are the important aspects, the most important aspects of competency-based education.
Mhm.
The field agrees you got to have competencies. Most of the higher education focused field that I know of, but I'm sure there are exceptions to this, agree that backward design is of critical importance. In fact, backward design is considered to be more and more important in more and more fields
Yeah.
than ever before. We've all recognized this idea: if you don't know where you're going, you can't get there.
Right.
Uh,
You
and
end up
so,
somewhere else.
yeah, and then you're surprised. Oh my goodness, how did I wind up here? Like my education. How did I wind up in educational measurement? I had no goals. I woke
Understood.
up and surprised myself.
Understood. So Neil, let's go back to access and equity.
Right.
How are those two concepts affected by competency-based education?
So if you design it the way that I'm saying, if you have that ability to start when you're ready to start and end when you're ready to end, um, if you can address sort of just-in-time learning. I have a new thing I need to learn. I'm ready to learn it. I need to learn it. Okay, let's go. Let's not wait until next September. Let's go whenever you're ready. If I was having some wonderful conversations, I've done some work with, interacted with folks at Fort Leavenworth, and they have the Command General College there. And the Army, like the Air Force, has been doing a lot of competency-based work, sometimes using that language. Currently they are.
Mhm.
Sometimes they haven't always used that language, but the ideas have always been there. When there is a course, a program that has to be there, the first thing they do is identify what are the things we want our soldiers to be able to do.
Mhm.
And so we've just been having all of these conversations and all of this use of backward design and all of this. And then we come to the question, what is it about the life of someone perhaps in a combat zone who still has to learn, because the world is changing, evolving around us all the time. Well, you have uptime and you have downtime, and you don't know where it's going to be or when it's going to be. You have to set up the program in advance to be ready for when the students are ready. And I want to make another connection, because this has had a profound effect on my thinking about lots of aspects of education, which is Montessori education.
Mm.
Teachers in K-12 often are worried about the idea of personalizing education for individual students, because, oh, I have so many students in my class, how can I prepare 30 different lesson plans? It's hard enough to only prepare one. They are right, but there's a way out of that problem. Stop preparing lesson plans at all. Pre-prepare all the lessons so they're sitting there on the shelf like in a Montessori school, ready for you to pull out that box and for that student to do what that student needs to do to learn. Sometimes it's first observe this student who's already working with that box of materials. Well, again, with this advantage of being able to start and stop whenever you need to, whenever you want to, you have to do some upfront work, because you're not just going to say, okay, I'll have this lesson prepared 2 hours in advance or a day in advance. No, I have all the lessons. So there's advanced work that has to be done, and it's at the program level that it all has to be done. But once you've done it, again, it's opening up access and equity, because everything's waiting there for when the student is ready for it, and you don't have to worry anymore that the student and the teacher have to be ready at exactly the same time, or it all falls to pieces.
Neil, you have a wealth of information, and you certainly have the passion to go with it. And unfortunately, we're out of time.
Oh, no!
We could talk forever, and I got some other ones for you. And you like almost opened up a can of worms with that last one. But we'll just have to save that for another time. So, Neil, if you could wrap all this up into a nice, neat takeaway that people could use, what would it be?
The neat takeaway is there are better ways of doing things. They're even not even necessarily brand new ways of doing things. We have to keep our eyes open. We have to get out of the box that we've been put into, and we just have to think about what is the end we have in mind. Frankly, if there's one major principle in all of this, it's that backward design that I was talking about. Let's know where we're going, and then we can get there.
And what do you want people to do? What's the call to action?
Start doing it. Get together, talk to colleagues.
Cassandra, would you pull up the slide?
Sorry?
Cassandra, would you pull up the slide?
Oh.
If people want to contact Neil, what's the contact information?
So LinkedIn will work, but you can also use my email address, neil.kingston@ku.edu.
Great. I'm David Johnson, Transform Ed Consulting, and it's a pleasure having you here this evening, Neil, and I hope we get to collaborate on other projects in the future. And I want to give thanks to my dear friend and colleague. You heard me call her name, Cassandra Williams. She's the brains behind Educational Innovations 360 Degrees. Look for both of us on LinkedIn, or you can look for our websites, Transform Ed Consulting or Education Innovations 360 Degrees. It's been a pleasure having you here, Neil, and to our audience, I wish you a wonderful evening.